Hi everyone, welcome to Jailbreaking Apple Watch. My name is Max Bazaliy, and I guess we begin. I'm a security researcher at a company named Lookout, where I focus on hardware and software exploitation. For the last few years, I was after of various jailbreaks for iOS, tvOS, and now for a watchOS. And the last year, I was lead researcher on a Pegasus exploit chain. So Apple Watch. What is Apple Watch? Basically, it's a smartwatch device that was released in 2015. It used Apple S1, S2, or S3 processor, depend on the model. But all the processors just a 32-bit ARM 7K architecture, which is derived from ARM 7A instruction set. So depending on the model, it's 512 or 768 megabytes of RAM, one or dual core processors, and all the models, they run watchOS. How does it work? So before you can use the Apple Watch needs to be paired with iPhone device. And Apple Watch prefers the Bluetooth connection for pairing and for installing application like extensions or over-the-air debug, so it uses Bluetooth. Apple Watch can use Wi-Fi as well for receiving calls, for receiving emails or messages, but Bluetooth remains as main communication channel. A few times I hear a question like, why do we even need to jailbreak a watch? First of all, it was interesting for me from a security researcher point of view to get access to a file system to understand how the watchOS works, and maybe like leak interesting user data like messages or emails. And after all, it will be nice to run debug tools on this small, teeny watch screen like Radar or Frida. And it can be used to attack iPhone. So we can send the malformed data back to iPhone and see what happens. So before going to deep into jailbreak details, a quick overview of Apple Watch security. I will not focus on each of those points. Just want to say that Apple Watch security is mostly equal than iOS security. The secure boot chain, the code signing, the sandbox, even the exploit mitigations like address space layout randomization, kernel mode, user mode, stack and heap canaries, data execution prevention, pretty much all the same as we see in iOS. So what are the possible attack vectors? I get a pretty good one-day exploit for WebKit that I plan to use on Apple Watch, but unfortunately, the WebKit is not supported yet on watchOS. So I played a little bit with DiExport. So there is a small diagnostic port on Apple Watch that we can connect to boot ROM and iBoot, send some message, receive some data back. This research is still ongoing. So basically, I switched to more easier way to jailbreak a watch, which called application extension based. Starting from watchOS 2, Apple added support for application extension, which means native code that's running on a watch. And if we pack our jailbreak inside the application extension and run on a watch, we can achieve the initial code execution. So this is how the jailbreak may look like. Initial code execution can be achieved by packing everything in application extension. Then we need to leak a kernel base or break KSLR. Next, dump the whole kernel, only for a kernel that are encrypted. I will talk about this a little bit later. Next, find gadgets, set up a primitives, patch kernel, disable security restrictions, run a stage client on a watch. Looks doable, right? So what are the bugs of interest that can be used to jailbreak a watch? I found that CVE 4656 was never fixed on watchOS 2. It was fixed only on watchOS 3 release. And in combination with CVE 4680, it can be used to jailbreak any versions of watchOS 2. For watchOS 3, that's a little bit different story. CVE 2370 is a pretty nice bug, and one bug is enough to jailbreak the whole system. And for watchOS 4, it's still ongoing research, but CVE 13861 looks pretty promising. Back to watchOS 2. So as we remember the list, we need to leak a kernel base. And there is a CVE 4680. It is a bug that I discovered back in January. And there is a lot of information how to exploit it. I just make a quick overview. So the object constructor missing bound checking, and the object is OS number, which basically represents a number in a kernel end. And attacker can create OS number object with higher number of bits, or in other words, with controlled length. And the problem is that later on, when we try to read the object back to user mode, the object length will be used to copy that many bytes from kernel stack that needed. So in other words, we control how many bytes will be copied from a kernel stack. We can leak the kernel pointer, and one kernel pointer is enough to determine where the kernel is located. And this bug is nice because it can be triggered from the application sandbox. And in combination with CV4656, which is user-free in iOS serialized binary, today Adam was pointing to this bug. Again, there is a lot of information how to exploit it. I just made a quick overview. So there is code that doing the serialization of the binary encoded data. And the object that represents a string, called the O string, was deallocated during the unserialization. But the pointer to the object still exists in the memory. So later on, the retain method will be called on the allocated object and goes to use after free. Which means if we reallocate O string object fast enough and point into a fake V table, we can get kernel level code execution. This bug can be triggered from the sandbox as well. So we know where the kernel is located in the memory. We break the Kaiser with info leak. We get the kernel exec. Now it's time to execute interesting gadgets in the kernel. But here's the problem for watchOS 2. In the time I was working on Jailbreak, there was no watchOS kernel dumps available in public. As well, there is no decryption keys for Apple Watch kernels. So back in the time, Apple was encrypting kernels for iOS, watchOS, and tvOS before they released watchOS 3. So I have an idea. If we control the O string, we can point the O string to the beginning of the kernel and read kernel as a string to user mode. The problem is that we need offset for a V table, which means and this V table offset is stored in a kernel, which means to dump a kernel, we need to know some information inside the kernel. It's like a chicken and egg problem. And I start to looking for any ways to dump this O string V table, and found there is a reference of O string V table in iOS serialized binary. And iOS serialized binary is referenced in iOS serialized XML. But the function that iOS serialized binary is exactly the same function that we get our bug, that we can call the user to free. And we can control all the input arguments in iOS serialized binary. So I have an idea. Why not try to leak some information of a kernel by a panic log? The panic log is just a log that's created by system when it crashes. So we can control the fake object, we can control the pointer to a fake V table. So what is, we use the address we want to leak as the address of the V table. So this address will be, and call the user to free. So this address will be dereferenced by a retain call. The system will crash because this address is not executable, but it will save the panic log. And the panic log will save all the register state, and one of the register will save the content of the address. So in other words, we can dump the 4 bytes of a kernel. So I say, that's interesting, that may work. It may be not the best way to dump a kernel, but I start to dump a kernel by 4 bytes until I find the reference to OS serialized OS string V table. So we use the address we want to leak as a V table address. The watch will crash. I wait until it restores. Then I jailbreak my phone, SSH to the phone, and run the special synchronization service, which fetch all the crash reports back to phone, copy them to my Mac, parse this panic, parse the register state, read 4 bytes, and put it in disassembler. Then repeat the whole thing. So overall, it takes me, I don't know, more than 50 crashes to dump these 4 bytes. And after each crash, watch take 4 or 5 minutes to recover, as I use the very, very first generation of a watch. And it takes another 4 minutes to run the synchronization service, copy it back to my Mac. So it's like 10 minutes per one crash. And it takes me 2 weeks to dump OS string table. But it was enough. It was enough to construct my exploit. So now I can create the OS string object, point it to the beginning of the kernel. I get the real table offset. So I read it to user mode using IO registry entry get property. So lick the kernel header, calculate the kernel size, and read the whole kernel into user mode. Which is good, but there is no symbols in it. So like there is just a raw memory dump. So I look for all the kernel extensions by looking for macro header magic. So find and list all the kernel extensions. I find the sysend table. The trick here that Apple did not change the sequence of the system calls to not break the backward compatibility, which means as soon as you find the beginning of the system call table, you can automatically resolve around like 500 symbols. The same thing for Mac traps. So if you find these two tables, you get around like 600 symbols in a dump. Well, IOKit object with table resolving may be useful too. Anyway, I get a kernel dump, I get a semi-symbolicator kernel. So I scan kernel for a good gadget, and as I get the exec primitive with user to free, I just use read and write primitive, read and write gadgets to set up a primitives. Again, I will not focus that much on a primitive. There is a white paper, so if you're interested, please like reference to it. watchOS 3, there is a different story. So kernels are not encrypted anymore, so which means that you don't need to dump it like by 4 bytes and symbolicate it. It got the symbols, but Apple changed a little bit security, which like new heap layout, some fixes in Apple mobile file integrity. It is a driver that checking for like code sign and all the certificates. And there is more sandbox restrictions, but it's still vulnerable to CV2370, which is pretty nice bug. It's a heap overflow in a Mac voucher extract recipe. And the problem is that there is a user mode structure, and one of the structural fields will be used as argument to copy-in function. And the copying data from user allocated buffer to a kernel allocated buffer. And as we control what we're copying and we control how many bytes we are copying, it leads to a fully controllable heap overflow. There are a few ways to exploit this bug. I prefer the one that Ian Beer presented, which we can allocate the Mac messages and corrupt the Mac message headers and corrupt the Mac message buffer bounds, which leads that we can read and write out of Mac message bounds. And this bug can be even used to leak the Kaiser. So if we'll know or leak the address of the heap, we can allocate the user client and read it back. And the very first pointer of object will be pointed to a vtable. And the vtable is always a constant, so we can calculate the Kaiser slide from the vtable address. Again, this bug can be triggered from the application sandbox. So both for watchOS 2 and watchOS 3, we got kernels. We set up the primitives. Now it's time to patch a kernel. So I use a classic approach. It's called the patch finder, as all the jailbreaks do before, to support that many variations of different kernels and offsets. So you look for string or byte pattern, find a reference to it, and with some additional instruction analysis, it's easy to find the beginning of the function or the variable you want to reference. Simple ARM emulator is super helpful to not doing all the calculation by hand. And again, syscall table and mactrack table. So as soon as you find the beginning of the tables, it automatically gives around 600 symbols, which can be used to do patches. So now it's time to patch a kernel. The first patch is how to get root, because we're still in a sandbox, we're still running as a mobile. And the fun thing, there is no kernel patch protector on Apple Watch. So which means as soon as we get the kernel right, we can easily patch the kernel code, and we can easily patch the kernel page tables to switch these pages to be writable. So in other words, just find setReid function and patch out the check which prevent you from non-privileged process to escalate to a root, and just call setReid 00. You get root. Or if you don't want to patch a kernel and like mess with all this kernel text, we can iterate a heap and find the proc structure for our process in a heap. And in this proc structure, it will be a pointer to ucred structure. In this ucred structure, it will be fields like uid, gid, just set them to zeros, which leads that our process became root. The same thing for a sandbox. So we are still sandboxed, but in ucred structure, there is a pointer to a sandbox label. And if we null out the sandbox label, there is no sandbox, so we can read and write pretty much anywhere on a system. Getting a kernel task. So kernel task is pretty nice way to read anywhere, write anywhere, and allocate the kernel memory. Again, if you can patch a kernel, we can patch the task for pit function and remove a check which preventing get kernel task port. Or there is other way without patching a kernel, iterate a heap and find the kernel task and save the send write, which is like a self, into our process task bootstrap port. Then read it back by task get special port and swap everything back. So in other words, we get the kernel send writes and return the special structure in user mode which contain the kernel send writes, or in other words, the kernel task port. And no kernel patching. So we get a kernel task. Now it's time to disable code sign checks. So there is a global variable called debug, and it got referenced by a function called pe I can has debugger. It's like internal Apple name. And it enabled the debugger capabilities around the kernel and all the kernel extension. So we can patch it globally by setting debug to 1. Or there is an import table, like NL symbol pointers. And there is like imports in kernel extensions. So we can redirect these imports to some functions that like return 1. So in other words, set p I can has debugger only for a kernel extension that we need. In addition, we need to patch CS enforcement disable and allow invalid signatures. There are two variables in Amphi kernel extension in constant data. Just patch them to 1. And this leads that we can run any unsigned code in Apple Watch. One last thing is remount the rootfs. So rootfs is mounted as read-only, which means if you want to add the new file as the root file system or like change any of existing ones, system will prevent us from doing it. But there is a function in the kernel called the mock mount, and it is checking if it is a root file system and if we are running on the release kernels, like return null or so. So just patch out this check and call mount to remount system partitions, the root partition as a read-write. There is other way to make this patch without like touching kernel text at all. In a heap, there is a root fs vnode pointer, and there is a pointer to mount flags. And one of the mount flags, it represents that this file system is a root file system. Just remove the root file system flag, call remount, and switch everything back. So we can remount file system without touching the kernel text. On the systems before Apple file system, there is 2 additional patch required. And there is lightweight volume manager, which basically set a hook on a write. So when you're trying, even with remounted file system, when you're trying to copy files to protected partition, it will not write any data. It will just write zeros. So we need to patch isWrite protected check and set PICAN has debugger to 1 on all the systems before Apple file system. Anyway, I remounted the root file system, and it's time to like drop the payload. So I recompiled the SSH client for ARM7K, and as well recompiled the basic tool package like ls, chmod for ARM7K, and copy everything to root file system. Then I ran a drop beer and was surprised because it got killed by a sandbox, which means that on watchOS there is much more restricted sandbox than on iOS. So the calls like bind, connect, send, receive they are forbidden. But as we get the kernel right, we can null out specific sandbox operations just in a sandbox kernel extension. So I done this, I run the SSH, and here's the problem. Here's a list of all the available interfaces on the watchOS. There is AWL0, which look like Apple Wi-Fi Direct. But in my case, it supports only the Bluetooth connection. And it was a problem. It was a problem for me because I planned to connect to Apple Watch directly from my Mac. And I started looking for a way how we can do it. Thanks for Luca Tedesco for pointing me to this trick. We can use mobile framework on a Mac to send a special message to a phone. Say, hey, please start forwarding service port with a port number 22 from a watch. We shall bind a port on a watch to some random port on a phone and return it in companion proxy service port. So in other words, we can bind the port on a watch to a port on a phone, then bind the port on a phone to port on a Mac, and connect it over the local host. This is how it looked like. I run my proxy, that bind the port, and now I can connect to the port I bound in from my Mac. It will use iPhone as a proxy over like USB Bluetooth proxy to connect to a watch. Yeah, we get the shell spawned, we run the uname, and we see it's watchOS 2.2 running on the very first generation of watch. I run the list of all the processors, and here is the jailbreak of the watch pound. In other words, watchOS is like super similar than iOS. It's just fork of iOS. Here is the drop beer instances running on watchOS. And as we get the SSH connection, we can copy files to watchOS, copy files from watchOS pretty much easy. So I recompile the NVRAM binary and use STP to copy it to Apple Watch. Copy into user bean. Okay, the password prompt. Yep, done. Now switch back to my SSH session. Run the nvram-p, which lists all the user mode accessible nvram variables. Similar thing to if you want to copy files from a watch. We can use SSH with a pipe and redirect it directly somewhere on your Mac. So in this example, I'm archiving all the private frameworks into a file called the frameworks tar, and it will be saved on my Mac. Yeah, to prove that we copied something, yeah, ls.la, we just dump it 1.5 megabytes. Yeah, so it was like a quick overview of SSH over the Bluetooth, but there is more. So we can SSH over the Wi-Fi, because the watchOS support the 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi spots. It's a little bit tricky to force watch to connect to it, but it works. So the interesting thing is that iPhone is not involved at all, which means we don't need to connect any proxies to a phone. We just need to leak the address of Apple Watch and connect it directly over the Wi-Fi. Yeah, so in this example, I already leaked the address of Apple Watch, and I just directly connect from my Mac, get a shell spawned. And in this case, I'm running the watchOS 3.1, again, on the very first generation of Apple Watch. The same list of the processes, the same STP. In this case, I recompiled the kekstat, is a special tool that lists all the kernel extensions just in the runtime. Copy it to my Apple Watch, run the kekstat. Yeah, so we see the address, we see the size, we see the name of all the kernel extensions in the runtime. Yeah, so as one of the final things, I recompiled the ping tool to prove that it works. If we null out all the sandbox restrictions, We can even force watch to talk with outer world. For example, let's try to ping Google. And yeah, as we see, it works. So that's Apple Watch SSH over the Wi-Fi. Okay, so Apple Watch, it has access to SMS, calls, health information, even some photos and other private data can be synced to a watch. Some of the models get access to GPS location directly or fetch it from a phone. It can be used to answer calls and involve it in Apple Pay. Of course, after you made a jailbreak, you get access to all the user-sensitive data, like messages, call histories, contacts, and so on and so on. I go deeper. I've wrote the framework that allow me to interpose and trampoline the system functions, which mean when the data got synchronized from a phone, I can catch it on my Apple Watch. Which means some stuff like call recordings is possible as well. So if you use the Apple Watch to answer a call on jailbroken watch, it's possible to record this call. It's even possible to create tweaks for a watch, as we see tweaks in CIDA, like change the layout of some of the UI elements and so on, or run tools like Frida and Radar on a watch. I would say that watchOS security is mostly equal to iOS. Apple doing a really great job to secure the both system, and it's pretty hard to jailbreak the modern Apple operating systems. But still, data forensics may be a little bit easier on a watch because there is no hardware protections like MCC, like KPP, and so I'm pretty sure Apple will add it in future models, but the data forensics is a little bit easier now. And as both systems are secure, the exploits for Apple Watch, for watchOS and iOS became even more valuable, as it's harder and harder to exploit it with each new versions. This is it. Do you guys have any questions? No questions? Oh, there is one.
Great presentation. Do you foresee Apple enabling kernel text protection so that it's not rewritable in the future, so you can't patch it?
Could you repeat, please? Because it's like.
Oh yeah. So earlier you had mentioned that you were able to just simply patch kernel text. Do you see Apple enabling read-write protections or write protections on kernel text in the future?
Well, I think as soon Apple will move to 64-bit processors for Apple Watch, they will add the kernel patch protection for sure. I think there's only reason why the lack of KPP on Apple Watch, because it's still 32-bit processor, and it's may cause additional performance loss, as the very first implementation of KPP was like a special, let me say, service that run in hypervisor and continuously check the kernel page tables. So I think that may be a performance reasons why they did not add it yet. If you're interested in more detailed exploitation, please refer to a white paper, how to exploit all the vulnerabilities that I just mentioned. And there is one of the first version of this talk, which was more detailed in a way how I dump the vtable by 4 bytes. So yeah, you can refer to it too. If no other questions, I think we're done. Thank you.